Let's talk about some gardening today. Whenever it's cold and miserable outside in the wintertime, I always want to think about gardens. And I wanted to share today that I think that if you've ever thought about starting a garden, but just didn't think you were ready or you just think you weren't prepared, well then I want to encourage you to make this the year that you go ahead and get started. And the reason I'm saying that is because I'm looking at this flooding in California and recognizing that without a garden, we are so dependent upon a commercial food system. And I don't see any way that we're not affected by those floods this summer. It's going to take California some time to come back from this. I mean, planting season should be happening very soon. And with grounds that are super saturated and infrastructure being destroyed and affected as it is, I think we're going to see a countrywide supply chain concern around produce. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have any food, and I don't want to create any panic, but it does mean that we are going to see some of the things that we are accustomed to having maybe not be as available as we're accustomed to. And it most certainly should affect the price, because with supply and demand as it is, if the supply is low and demand is high, the price is going up. So let this be the year that you start a garden, and I wanted to share my 4 tips for starting a garden successfully. And while January isn't a time for planting, it is a time for planning, preparation, and seed starting if you're starting indoors. Starting indoors gives you a huge jump start into the spring season. It allows me to take mature plants and put them out instead of starting from seed. I have a relatively short growing season where I live, so preparing by starting seeds indoors is a really, really good idea. Step 1 of the 4 basic steps for starting a garden is to remember that for your first year, start small. Unless you have a lot of support, a lot of infrastructure already in place, and an abundance of time, I would recommend starting small. It's just so much to get used to if you haven't done a garden before that you want to start out with a relatively small plot and a relatively limited amount of vegetables. The more variety you have, the more work and the larger the learning curve. Starting small doesn't mean that you have to go out and even till over a patch of your backyard. It means that you could put containers on your patio and start small in that way. I grew a lot of food out of pots and garden boxes off of a small patio from an apartment. And then as we bought a house and we started moving up into having more space, we built a larger garden plot, and then a larger garden plot, and then a larger garden plot. And it just kept getting bigger as I got more experience. Now, I grew up as a gardener. My parents had a garden. I grew up in an Amish community. All the neighbors had gardens, so I did have experience. But even with experience, it took some time to get accustomed to doing it on my own. My second suggestion for new gardeners is to remember that it's okay to start out with seedlings your first year. It's less expensive to buy seeds for sure, but it doesn't always mean it's the right thing to do. Starting from seed and managing getting a seedling hardened off and ready to go outside of the garden and transitioning successfully and still harvesting is a challenge, and there's a learning curve. Doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that if you're looking to start out and making it easy on yourself, starting small and starting with seedlings might be a safe way to go. The least expensive way to buy seedlings is to go to garden centers and look for 6 packs or 12 packs of things, because buying them in bulk will get you a better price. They're going to be already hardened off, ready to go into the garden. And that means that you're coming home with 6 or 12 of the exact same plant. And you might not need 6 or 12 of anything if you're a new gardener. So this brings me to step 3. And step 3 is work together with some friends. If you can find some friends and some neighbors who are also interested in gardening, it's really a good idea to plan together and share what you intend to buy. So for example, if you go to get cauliflower plants and you find 6 or 12 pack of cauliflower plants, but you only want to plant 3 or 4 to start out, then find a neighbor or a friend who also wants to buy some and go in on it together. Working with neighbors and friends can include doing things like seed swaps if you are starting with seeds, but it can also mean plant swaps. Maybe you decide to start some things from seed and you get a pack of 50 seeds and you go a little crazy and you decide, hey, I'm going to plant 20 of them, and you get all 20. Well, then maybe it's time to go ahead and swap with some people or sell some of your seedlings and use that money to buy something else. But working together with friends who have a common interest in gardening is a great way to be social and also to grow food together. My 4th tip is that if you're starting small and you want to get the most out of your garden experience, then you want to start with nutritionally dense foods. And this means that we're going to put our time into planting things that are going to give you the most nutrition for the least amount of time. Good examples of foods that don't give you a lot of nutrition: corn. Everybody loves sweet corn. Sweet corn's great, but it's not very nutritious. It really doesn't feed us much in terms of nutrition. So I would recommend going with things like peppers, peas, cauliflower, broccoli, all of your greens, spinach, kohlrabi, chard. Put in cabbage, like red cabbage. Sweet potatoes are nutritionally dense. Garlic, beets, onions. These are all foods that are relatively easy to grow and are nutritionally dense. I would say the exception to that might be cauliflower and broccoli, because broccoli can get worms and you have to net it over. But other than that, these are nutritionally dense foods that are relatively easy to grow. All right, if you've gotten through the first 4 steps and you've found a location that you want to start gardening, then we can start talking about planning. And planning starts now. Planning starts in January. I have been sitting looking at seed catalogs all winter, and now it's time to go ahead and put my orders in. Generally, I like to even order sooner than this, but I had a lot of seeds left over and I didn't need to buy many. So I'm just looking at what my gaps are and buying what it is that I need. I want to show you how I organize my seeds. I came up with this several years ago. I've used every seed storing method on the planet. I had shoe boxes, I had plastic bins, I've had envelopes of seeds, I've had them all over the place. And I finally decided that I wanted something that was easy to carry, easy to organize, and if I dumped it, it wasn't going to dump all over the garden and have to be picked up. I'm speaking from experience here. I've done it many times. So what I came up with was putting, my boys had their merit badge cards from Boy Scouts in these plastic sleeves. And I thought, oh, I could use those for seed packets. So that's what I did. I got a 3-ring binder and I just put my seed packets in these clear sleeves. It's really great because I can see the back information. And what it is, I keep them in alphabetical order in here and I can carry it around the garden and it just doesn't go anywhere unless you turn it completely upside down. But let's just pretend that I never do that. So I'm going through, first of all, I go and look at my notes from last year. I keep really good notes when I plant in my garden. Now I have a pretty sizable garden, which is hard to manage, but I am now dedicated full-time at home to working my business from home and gardening. So I have more time to invest. That doesn't mean it's not a lot of work, but good planning helps make it a lot easier. So I start out by looking at last year's notes. I take really good notes about what I planted, where I planted it, how successful it was, and whether I would do it again. And then I also have really good notes about each garden bed and how many hours of sun it gets. The very eastern edge of my garden is blocked from the sun in late afternoon. So I have to put things there that are a little tender to the heat and like a little shade, but things that need full sun can't go back there. Step 2 is to make a list of what it is I actually want. And then do I have the seeds to start them? So, you know, I have a whole page of arugula here, so I think we're okay. And then I'm going to go through, I realized I have bush beans, but I don't have pole beans. And I prefer pole beans because I grow them on an arch. So with that one on the list, you can see there's empty space here. That's where my pole beans got used up. And then I'm just going through. I have 6 packets of carrots, so I should be fine. And then making a list of what it is I'm actually going to need. And that list was pretty short this year because I have a lot left over. Okay, now this might bring up the question of, can I keep old seeds? And the answer is yes, of course you can. You can keep old seeds and you can use them rather successfully. However, I think some people will tell you that you have to throw away old seeds because we've been told that they expire. Now imagine that that's probably a little bit of marketing coming from the companies who sell seeds who want to make sure that you keep buying new seeds. Now, I will tell you that you're probably not going to get 100% germination year after year, but you'll get enough germination that it's worth keeping them. So I have planted seeds up to 5, 6, 7 years old and still had some success, but the germination rate goes from 100% to 0% over the course of however many years. It's different seed by seed. My recommendation is the older the seed packet is, the more you'll need to start per position to be able to make sure that you get something ready. The reason we're talking about this in January is because I'm starting seeds very, very soon. I am going to go out and get my soil together, and I start indoors in trays on heat mats to get them started. And then I add lights once they've started to sprout. And then we go through the process sometime in March, April, where we need to start taking them out on nice days to get them accustomed to an outdoor climate. And I call this plant daycare where we take all the children out for a little bit in the beginning and then a little more the next day and a little more the next day. We're trying to expose them to different temperatures. We're trying to expose them to wind and all kinds of things to strengthen them, to make them hardier and ready for the garden. If they start outside in cool temperatures, they're already hardened off and ready to go. You only have to do this with your seedlings, especially if you're growing them in a perfect environment like the inside of your home. So how do you decide what you want to plant every year? Well, that comes down to choosing from that nutritionally dense list of plants that are going to be the best for your family. And it comes from B, growing things that you're actually going to eat. And then C, what does your climate or your garden allow you to have? If you have a lot of shade, you're going to have to reconsider what your list is, as opposed to having intense sun. You're going to have to consider what that list will be. And that information is so readily available when you go to seed companies and look at their packets. Even if you're buying plants, go look at seed companies, read the information about that plant, and you'll be able to find out, can I grow this in my climate? Sit and watch. What does your garden do? Does it have a lot of sun during the day, or does it have a lot of shade? And remember that whatever that is right now is going to be different in the summer, because the sun will be higher, and part of my garden is shaded right now, but it won't be in the summer because the sun will be higher in the sky. Okay, with all of that planning comes some actual physical planning on pencil and paper. Go out and measure the space that you have available to you and decide, how do you want to garden? Do you want to garden in traditional beds in the ground? I use raised beds because the area where I garden is very wet, and raised beds allow me to keep everything up and out of the water that can collect. We're working on drainage and it is getting better. However, I just find that I like raised beds. I can contain what I want to the beds, and we have all these great walking paths in between, and I like it aesthetically, and I like it for planting purposes. All of my beds are the same size, and that allows me to put hoops over top of them. I can add plastic and make a bunch of little mini greenhouses, and that allows me to extend my garden season as well. Okay, so I've made my list of what I want to grow. I've drawn out what my beds look like, how much space I have, and then I'm going to look to the back of that seed packet, because that's where a lot of information comes from. Here's an example on some peas. These are little sugar snaps. And when I look at the back of the packet, it has the planting depth, it has the spacing between plants, and how long it takes to get them to germinate, how long it takes them to grow. And it always will tell you, a seed packet's going to say 50 days to harvest or 85 days to harvest. And that's the most important piece of information, because from the time that this seed gets wet and hits the ground until you can harvest your piece of vegetable or fruit off of it, that's what that means. So that goes into your planning. If I'm going to put peas in this bed, how many days am I going to have that bed tied up? And what can I do with it after peas are done? If I pull these peas out, can I put kale in for the fall? You bet I can. And that's usually what I do, is I start making plans for succession planning. The other thing that you really want to be considering is growth habit. Do you have a climbing plant that needs some sort of trellis or support system? And tomatoes are the best one to talk about here. Look for determinate or indeterminate varieties. If you only have enough room in a garden bed to put a stake in and have a tomato plant that's going to go 3 or 4 feet tall, then you're going to need a determinate tomato variety. Now, maybe you have a trellis. I use fence from one bed to the next, and I use these trellis systems that allow me to put indeterminate tomato plants in. That means that I'm going to keep getting tomatoes all season long, but that plant's going to keep growing all season long, and it's going to give me a lot of tomatoes. But I have to have the infrastructure for it. Determinate varieties are ideal for things where you want a lot of tomatoes at once, like Romas, your canning tomatoes. Determinates are great because they all come at once. I bring them in, I make them into sauce, or I can them, and then we put them away and we're done with it. So you'll have to decide, what do you want and how much space do you have? Do you have the infrastructure for it? There are a lot of guides online that can give you resource on how to plan this out, how much space you'll need, what kind of trellis system you might need. But again, if you're starting out new, and I'm encouraging this video for new gardeners who haven't done it before, I want you to think about growing the things that are manageable and easy, those nutrient-dense foods. Plant a lot of kale and spinach if you want, because it's really, really good for you. All right, the last thing I want to say about becoming a new gardener is that I want you to look at it from a different perspective than the work that's involved in it, and think about it in terms of the value that it gives to you. My father-in-law was an outstanding gardener, and I spent a lot of time with Dad in the garden. And one thing that I loved about it is that he was the hardest working person that I knew, and it was a lot of hard work. But it was also a great love. And the time that we spent together talking in the garden, I learned so many things. I also enjoyed just getting out and getting some sun exposure. When I worked full time, I would come home after work and spend a little time in the garden with him. And I was amazed what we were able to accomplish in just a couple of hours a day. So that grew for me and grew and grew for me. I don't have him in my life anymore, but I do have the memories that we shared in the garden and the things that he taught me. And if you can reshuffle your schedule a little bit and reprioritize some time, you can be very, very successful in a garden with just a little bit of time each day. And if you skip a day or two, that's okay, because gardens can usually function pretty well on their own for a day or two. I wish you good luck. I hope that you get started in a garden. Start small, start with your favorites, and grow a little bit more every single year. I'd love to see more and more gardeners join us. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'd be happy to answer for you. And good luck to you. Have a great gardening year. I can't wait to hear your feedback.